right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I see many friendly faces, familiar faces on this call. So welcome and happy Friday to all of you. My name is Amber Sharples. I'm the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Arts Council, here, the state agency for the arts. And we felt as a state agency and the work that we've been doing to try to help with the sector's response to the pandemic, both in terms of financial resources and also support in other ways to help empower you in your work, that we would try to give you an update in this ever-changing, very ever-changing and nebulous path and journey we're on regarding pandemic funding and the arts. So with that, we have a presentation. I hope to give a real brief summary and synopsis of the journey we've been on and what we're trying to do to advocate and get additional funds in order to support your work and your rebuilding and reopening in this pandemic environment and ecosystem. And then we want to have an opportunity. I really want this to be conversational, an opportunity for questions and answers. And then we'll just close. I do want to just be incredibly candid and transparent in this space, that there are a lot of unknowns, and this conversation and journey seems to change very frequently. So I hope that if I can't answer your question, I can do some research and circle back to you. We will try to be as forthright as we can about what we do know in this space, what we are doing to support and advocate for more funding and secure funds as the state agency, and how we plan on looking at how we can invest those to build a stronger Oklahoma and help you all, as the arts sector has been so completely impacted by this pandemic over the last 18 months. So with that, we're just going to jump in, and we are going to have the chat room, and Joel Gavin, our Director of Marketing and Communications, is going to try to help me in that space to monitor and bring any questions or comments you have to light to try to make this as inclusive as possible as a process of communication. So with that, we will just jump in. We will have that opportunity for Q&A. So please, if things come up as you're seeing them or as I'm speaking, please feel free to use that space. So we will just jump in the first slide. So in September, I think everyone has understood and has been watching in the news that the American Rescue Plan Act funding was passed. And in September of this year, I was asked, as one of many state arts or state agencies and individuals who work on the statewide sector and scope, to come and present to members of the Joint Committee on the ARPA funding. We had the opportunity on September 17th, in particular, to present a status of the arts sector to the working group, Government Transformation and Collaboration. This working group is a subcommittee working group of the full Joint Committee on ARPA funding. It is headed by Senator Chuck Hall of Perry and Representative Boatman. And what I will say to this is that we had a wonderful opportunity to share what's happening with our sector. And I wanted to share with you what we are sharing with the legislature. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we talked about, not asking for additional funds at that time, but really just talked about where the sector is. So on the sector status, you know, what we first kind of out the gate, we talked about that the arts sector was one of the first to close, and we will most likely be one of the last sectors to fully reopen, given that the arts are inherently part of bringing people and audiences and communities together. You know, we talked about it resulted in shuttered venues, reluctant audiences, and canceled or hybrid programming, canceled fundraisers and galas, and other vehicles to help you pull in additional revenue resources and funding streams. And at the same time, we talked about how the arts sector was incredibly responsive during the pandemic, pivoting to respond to a new reality. We saw organizations experiencing fatigue. I bet you're feeling it. I know we are at the Arts Council, confronting cost increases. You're working with fewer resources and you're being asked to do more. And we see that. We see what's happening, and we're trying to find ways to support you in that work. And this is what we shared. We knew that many organizations had actually closed their doors. Many were continuing to provide services, but on a smaller scale, or those programs were in jeopardy jobs were being lost, people were having hiring freezes, or they were actually losing their teams or portions of their teams. Next slide, please. We talked about on the national data, just looking from March 20th to April 2021, the national data coming out of the Americans for the Arts shows that the loss of the arts and cultural nonprofit sector was $16 billion, with an additional nearly $16 billion in loss in related audience spending, and the economic impact to communities, the government revenue loss, and of course, jobs no longer being supported, nearly close to 1 million. And we saw that the arts nonprofit sector had a higher job loss than its respective nonprofit sector in general, looking at communities and organizations working with areas of social services, food insecurity, et cetera. The arts nonprofit sector had nearly a 5 times the national average loss of jobs and canceled contracts related to artist services. Next slide, please. In Oklahoma, and I'll talk a little bit where we got this data, and thanks to all of you for participating in any reporting that you do for final reports. This is how we take this data and use it for case making. From March 20th to December 2020, we saw in Oklahoma alone, the arts and cultural organizations experiencing nearly $44 million in total revenue and income loss, with 1/2 of our grantees experiencing more than 50% of revenue loss, and 1/3 of them experiencing more than 75% revenue loss. Next slide. In addition to the revenue loss, we saw a nearly an average of 57% increase on top of plummeting revenue increases to annual operating budgets. And so if you look at those two things together, revenue plummeting and increase in expenditures skyrocketing, it really created the perfect storm for organizations to experience huge fatigue, as well as loss of their programming, as well as their people. Next slide. And here's some additional breakdown of what we saw in terms of job loss and canceled contracts. Next slide. We talked a little bit with this, the working group asked the Arts Council to talk about what we had done in response to the pandemic since it started in March of 2020. We talked very briefly about our adaptation of our grant making, providing support for virtual programming, the fact that we were convening leaders and organizations statewide on a monthly basis to talk about best practices and the shifting ecosystem and foundation of our work. We developed tools such as our emergency resource page, which was at one time updated daily with hundreds of resources, both on the state, regional, and national level. We published numerous resources about how to, with best practices about digital programming, everything from how to disinfect and think about audience-based spaces with COVID early on when we were still learning in this new pandemic environment. And then we also went beyond just the health and safety of our organizations and communities, but we really wanted to dive in, and we continue to work in this space of well-being resources, working with Oklahoma Museums Association and others to talk about what the mental health toll has been on our sector, which I believe we really do continue to see impact of burnout, fatigue, and mental health well-being of our sector as a whole, which we can talk about later. We also commissioned some online fine arts curriculum to try to help schools, homeschoolers, parents, educators, and everyone in between, trying to help equip students that were working in a virtual or hybrid and sometimes very ever-changing ecosystem to try to make sure that arts education was still accessible and on their learning platforms. And then we also, and what I'll talk to, and this is where we'll kind of get into the heart of why I'm sure all of you are here, is to talk about how we really distributed the arts, the CARES Act funding in record time. I'm so proud of our team who's on this call. I'll talk in a little bit more specificity about the CARES Act funding, but we started advocating and working with the governor's office, as well as the state legislature and the state's budget team in June of 2020 to get and secure additional funds through the CARES Act funding that was provided to the state. We started in June. We were contacted right before Thanksgiving, and we had 19 working days to get $3 million out the door. And it was truly the feat of an incredible team that was dedicated, especially during the holidays when they'd already had a lot of fatigue. I'm really proud of the work that we did, but we haven't stopped fighting for additional resources for you. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that here as we move forward. Next. So pandemic response. It first started with the CARES Act funding. Next slide. So in the summer of 2020, in June of 2020, we received funding directly from the National Endowment for the Arts. The National Endowment received $75 million. 40% of their funding must go to regional and state arts agencies based on a formulaic funding based on census data, as well as other competitive funding determinations and criteria. We had $499,500, a little more than, we were able to support 101 arts mission-based organizations in 24 communities. These funds went directly towards job retention, organizational stability, and direct expenditures related to COVID costs. We prioritized rural, culturally diverse, under-resourced, and underrepresented communities, and the grants ranged anything from $900 to $10,000. In the winter of 2020, oh, if you go back, please. In the winter of 2020, the state, as I had mentioned earlier that summer, at the same time that we had received the National Endowment for the arts funding, we started having communication with the governor's office, as well as I mentioned, the legislature and the budget office, about the additional funds that were provided directly from the federal government to the states for CARES Act distribution. In this case, in the CARES Act, the governor had full discretion of the investment of these dollars. So for 6 months, we worked tirelessly behind the scenes, working with stakeholders, providing a lot of different proposals about how we would utilize the funds. We first asked for 10 million. We were asked to then come back and give a redefined proposal at 2.5 million. And ultimately, right the week of November of Thanksgiving, we were called and told that we would be getting $3 million, but we had to have those funds not only vetted, but they must have been distributed by December 30th to meet the CARES Act funding requirements. So as you can imagine, it was quite a feat, but I'm very proud of the fact that we funded nearly 170 organizations in 48 communities. We focused arts organizations. They were able to get funding based on full operating budget because they were arts focused. Non-arts organizations, we provided funding based on a portion of their budget that was dedicated to arts programming. In this case, this isn't the full list of eligibility, but areas that we focused on was pandemic related payroll, business interruption costs, public safety, helping the organizations safely reopen, helping with hybrid and virtual programming costs, among others. And these grants were ranged from as low as $375 to $100,000. Next slide, please. So now we finished with the CARES Act, and the CARES Act has come to a close. And yet we obviously knew as a sector and as a community and as a state and nation that the pandemic was not over. And so with the passing of the American Rescue Plan Act, known as ARPA, we also have the opportunity for 2 funding streams that we hope to secure. The first is one that we've already secured, and this is based very similarly to the first funding from the CARES Act, but in the ARPA funding, rather than the National Endowment receiving $75 million and distributing those funds across the state, their appropriation and allocation was much more, which resulted in us receiving an award of $799,500. So we have been notified of this grant amount. We have not received the funds yet in hand. We will be presenting and taking guidelines and a timeline to our full governor appointed council this next week at the Oklahoma Arts Conference as part of our council meeting. We must, due to the NEA's guidelines, expend all of these funds by June of 2022. So we have a window of time, about 9 months, to get these funds expended, vetted, and expended. And our tentative application opening is early calendar year 2022. So after the new year, please kind of watch our newsletter, our social media, as we will open up the timeline for the NEA portion of our ARPA funding, most likely in the early new year. Right now, we don't have criteria and those aspects finalized by our council, but we just want to give you a heads up of what we're looking at in terms of our timeline. So be on the lookout. You have plenty of time. You haven't missed anything. Next slide, please. We have a wonderful opportunity. The CARES Act funding was a much smaller amount compared to the $1.8 billion that is being provided to the state. Our agency has submitted a request titled the Creative Sector and Cultural Tourism Recovery Plan. We have requested $94.7 million. Of course, this is a wish, but we're trying to be bold. We believe that the sector merits this kind of investment to build the Oklahoma of tomorrow with both short-term and long-term investment strategies and approaches. Our proposal was submitted on October 3rd. If you've heard in any of the conversations or through other webinars or conversations in general, the portal opened on October 1st. So we submitted ours right after that. In fact, we have been working on it since last June, and I'm really proud of that. It covers a 3-year period, so it's not a one-time yearly investment. It's much more strategic in its approach. We've been working with the Lieutenant Governor's Office, who is our Cabinet Secretary, the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits, as well as regional partners such as Allied Arts Oklahoma City and Tulsa Arts Alliance and their member agencies to talk about what is needed in communities to help our arts organizations and cultural partners rebound. In conversations with the Joint Committee on ARPA funding, there are 24 members. I've had one-on-one meetings or phone conversations with the majority of those members. There is a strong emphasis on rural and vulnerable populations being prioritized in ARPA funding. So I just want to make that clear that we are hearing from members that that is the focus of where these funds will go, because additional funds will be sent to the municipalities and counties in Oklahoma City and Tulsa and across the state. And so the state legislature, what I have been hearing, appears that rural and vulnerable populations per the ARPA guidelines are a strong priority for the legislature with these funds. Next slide, please. Our tiered response to the pandemic really looks at 4 things. We are looking at the long-term recovery and sustainability of our sector across the state. We also know that capacity building, so many organizations need funding or people and need other professional development opportunities to strengthen our sector's role in our economy. This being to help employ artists, as well as arts administrators and educators on the local level. We're also looking to strengthen the arts in rural downtowns and urban neighborhoods through unique economic development opportunities. And I'll talk about that later. And one of the things that we're always looking for is data. We need a good economic impact study of our sector, and we want to talk and look at that in a new light. Next slide, please. Our goals in our proposal really look at economic development as the forefront, being aligned with ARPA and the way that ARPA is looking at infrastructure, both of people and also as brick and mortar. Looking at physical enhancements, looking at how we can create the built or natural environment and leverage art-centric build outs, looking at how we can reduce or ignite vacant or blighted spaces through the arts, especially in rural and under-resourced communities, and looking at building the Oklahoma of tomorrow that we want, using the redevelopment of arts, cultural, and public spaces through through temporary and permanent enhancements. We want to look at social capital. You know, the pandemic obviously eroded a lot of social relationships and engagement in communities. And we want to use the arts to help with social cohesion and community attachment to build stronger communities across the state. we know that this will result in stronger cultural tourism, driving economic development on the local level. And then we also know that we want to use this space and these funds for systematic improvements. We want to look at building stronger personnel and technology across our sector. I think one of the things that we all probably walked away from in terms of COVID was the need for up-to-date technological resources and best practices and knowledge and understanding of how we're going to thrive in the post-pandemic ecosystem as a sector. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we requested. And again, this is just a wish. None of this is secured, but I want to just let you know what we've asked for and how we wanted to approach this, so you're in the know. The first has been to look at a part one, reopen, recovery, and rebuild our sector. This would be to help with funds to address revenue loss, as well as giving organizations the funding to have a lot of flexibility in terms of investing in all the needs that they may have based on what the pandemic showed us in terms of our practices, our technological infrastructure, our personnel, and other aspects of our work. And so we're really looking at a step down approach where we would have $20 million the first year, $15 million, and then 10 over a 3-year period. And this would really be funding highly at the jump start. So it would be more heavy on the front end in year 1 and go down over the 3-year period. What I'd like to also point out is in the conversations we've had with the legislature, there has been a strong emphasis on rural and vulnerable populations, and those would be prioritized in this funding, looking at especially at our small to medium-sized organizations, helping them as they may not have had as much accessibility to other funding streams. Next slide. We're also looking at, I don't know if you've been watching all the commercials, but everyone in our vicinity, Missouri, Arkansas, other states, are really vying for a marketing campaign that are driving cultural tourism out of our state through marketing and commercials, driving Oklahomans to go spend money in other areas and other states. We would like to use and request funding about really pushing a marketing and campaign strategy to drive cultural tourism, both for Oklahomans and those in our region and nationally to come spend money in Oklahoma. We're also looking at some funding requests related to qualitative and quantitative data collection, as well as the economic impact study. Next slide. Part 2, and this is one I'm really excited about, is a WPA inspired initiative to fortify and amplify creative rural downtowns and neighborhoods for economic development through creative industries. This is a collaboration. We've had multiple conversations with the staff, as well as the members of the Department of Commerce's Main Street program and our cultural district initiative, as well as many communities that may not be in the cultural district program, but of which we have had conversations with, that are using art-centric enhancements to drive quality of life, economic opportunities, as well as cultural tourism to our states and our communities. Year 1, this is a 3-year initiative where we're looking to identify communities across the state, municipalities, as well as others, where we could drive strategic planning and conversations around what these communities would like to utilize in terms of public art and other ways to engage spaces, those that have shovel-ready projects, and then also on a multi-year level, looking at continued art-centric enhancements across the state, and then completing those over a 3-year period. This ask is $45 million. Next slide. So here's what we know so far. The goals of the Joint Committee, and these have been made public on the website, which we will share, and have been in the conversations as I've listened to the Joint Committee and working group meetings, these public meetings. The 3 goals are to build a stronger, more innovative, and more diverse Oklahoma economy. The second is to enhance capabilities of state services for the well-being of all citizens, especially the most vulnerable, and invest in physical and digital infrastructure to expand opportunities across Oklahoma. And we feel confident at the Arts Council that our request aligns with the goals of the committee. The eligible ARPA uses, as have been made public so far, the goals of the use has been to support the public health response, respond to the negative economic impact of the pandemic, which I think in the case of the arts, we have ample data in that space, premium pay for essential workers, revenue loss, which we also have great data for, and investments in infrastructure. And when we talk at the Arts Council about infrastructure, we're talking about not only infrastructure of people, but spaces, and utilizing the power and transformational power of the arts to build a stronger Oklahoma. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, and I just want to make sure that I make this and share this information as much as I can, the real focus and priority that we have built into our request, as well as what we're hearing so far, has been that rural and vulnerable populations being served through these funds is the highest priority and focus. The timeline for ARPA is that the funds from the state must be encumbered by 2024 and spent by 2026. And what I will tell you is that what that means, and what I want to share with you all, and at what we are taking at the Arts Council, is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. We anticipate that this will take months, if not maybe years, to come to fruition. So patience will be, and resiliency and tenacity will be needed by all as we work in this space. Right now, the process of the Joint Committee and overall process as we know it is that the project intake is the current status and phase that the committee is in right now. There were two options to submit for consideration. The first was an idea intake form, which had about 10 questions, and then the project intake, which had 30 questions plus questionnaire. And that is the form that we took when we sent in our, I think, more flushed out project ideas of how we would like to approach the ARPA funding, both to support the arts and nonprofit sector, and then also kind of twofold, the WPA inspired approach. And we don't see either one of these working without the other, because we can build beautiful spaces across the state and public art, but we also know that we need to strengthen the arts and cultural organizations that provide programming and support the use of those spaces. So we really see it as one that has a mutual understanding and relationship where we need both to strengthen the arts overall. The next phase will be a preliminary eligibility review, where they will be looking at the requests and proposals and whether or not they pass the eligibility criteria. Then those that pass the eligibility and are given the green light will be then assigned to 4 working groups, which I'll talk about here in a second. After they come out of the working groups, they will then go and be presented before the Joint Committee. And this is a bipartisan House and Senate member committee, 24 members. And then there will be a final eligibility review if it comes with a pass or a go and a recommendation for funding from the Joint Committee. Then it will go to a steering committee, and then it will be then ultimately sent to Governor Stitt, who will then either approve or deny the proposal. Next slide. Here are the joint committees. There are 4 working groups. There's Economic Development and Workforce, with a focus on business, commerce, and education, Health and Human Services, Government Transformation and Collaboration, and then Transformation, Infrastructure, and Rural Development. Based on the fact that in September, I was asked to come and present in the hearing for the Government Transformation and Collaboration, and because it covers tourism, which is our cabinet secretary for our agency, while I can't be certain, I am confident that we will probably land in the Government Transformation and Collaboration Working Group if our proposal makes it that far. Next slide, please. So what can you do next? What in the time frame as we're kind of waiting? We ask that you stay tuned to our agency's newsletter and social media. I think one of the things that really empowers us in our case making as we present, and I anticipate having many hearings or many conversations as I continue working with legislative members, as well as having any public hearings related to our proposal and how we would apply these funds across the state, is that we need good data. We need it twofold, both quantitative and qualitative data. We need to know what's happening in the pandemic and its impact on your communities, as well as your organization. And we also need to have the heartstring stories that really tell the human side of the pandemic's impact and how the arts have been so important in helping our communities through this time. Please tell your current legislative members how the CARES funding that you did receive helped save people, jobs, and programs. When we're ultimately trying to work at the last minute to secure these funds, what really gives us an opportunity to really make a case is the one-on-one relationships that you may have with your legislative members. Please share the pandemic's impact with your legislators. Ask them for coffee, take them to lunch, send them information. I think the more personable you can make it, the better. We can send a listing of the Joint Committee members, but sharing the pandemic's impact on the sector to them, letting them know what it means on the ground, what you're seeing, giving them the real stories. Sometimes whenever an agency head comes to a committee, it may not have the personal feel and story that they understand is in their backyard or in their region or in their community. And I ask that you consider inviting your legislators to your events that you're having right now, cultivating these relationships as we continue to work over the coming months. And I anticipate maybe months, years in this space. Cultivating these relationships and your personal stories are more powerful than anything I can do in a hearing to make the case. I know that that's something that you hear pretty regularly, but asking that you continue to keep them abreast of what's happening in your community will help us on our end. And then next. So I'm happy to answer any questions and open up the forum. I really wanted this to be more conversational and just tell you what we do and don't know, and what we're doing to strive behind the scenes and in the front lines to see what we can do to support your work out in the field. So with that, I will turn it over and open it up for questions. Feel free to add questions to the chat. Might be easier. I don't know if we can see all the pages of friendly faces out there.
Amber, this is Kay Decker from up in Northwest Oklahoma.
Hi, Kay.
I have a question that I'm struggling to get an answer to, and I have spoken with our legislative contingent. And so you may not know the answer to this, but I'm asking everybody who might have a possible answer. Do you have any idea what is the expected timeline for the working groups and the joint committee? I can't seem to get an answer for that, and that would be very helpful if, for example, we need to move up our annual audit a month, or if our regular time period right after the first of the year is okay. That would help some of us who don't have a gigantic team of staff, if we could plan out some of this with a little bit of knowledge on timeline.
I completely understand your experience. I have had some of the same difficulties in securing exact timelines. In fact, if you notice, the portal opened on October 1st, but it does not have a closing date. And one of the things that indicates to me is that they're waiting to see how many requests they're going to get. I know at one point there were conversations of them anticipating thousands of requests since they were opening it up to the public. And so I think a lot of it is they're waiting to see what the need, how much they're going to have to vet.
Okay.
I know that's not very helpful because
okay. Well, no, that's fine. I mean, we're not sitting around wasting time, but I just wonder, if we need to try and get this in by the end of October, where I'm working on actually 5 different projects for this region.
Mm-hmm. I can say that a couple of legislators were very candid with me and said it's better to have a well flushed out proposal than a rapidly created one. I think what they're looking for is the quality of the proposal rather than being the first in line. And I don't know if that helps you or not.
That I've heard that conversation. So,
right.
Yeah.
I think I saw that Erin Gavigan had her hand raised. Did I,
yes.
Joel?
Hi. Go ahead, Erin.
Hey.
Hi, Amber, and everybody. Thank you for doing this. My quick question is, do you have any preference, like if an organization, an arts organization has maybe a larger project or request that we were considering making directly to the ARPA portal, do you have a preference that we wait and go through OAC, or are you okay with us making our own proposals?
I think if your board and staff is telling you that you need to move forward with a direct request, I would go ahead and do that. I will say that we would probably take it into consideration if an organization received ARPA funding directly from the legislature, that we would probably try to spread the funds that we receive farther, so that rather than it being duplicative, we would look at that maybe being an indication of priority of funding. I can't say that with certainty, but I would just be honest about where we are in that space. I would also ask that you just I would like to know what you're asking for, especially as I'm meeting with members, because if they start asking me about it, if I'm deer in headlights, that is not a good place to be, where I look like the arts sector doesn't have a unified approach. So that would be my request. I don't need to get into the nuances of what you're doing. I do think the more we can centralize it, the more stronger and unified we are, and which is why I approached Allied Arts and Tulsa Arts Alliance and Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits when we were developing our proposal that you saw. Then we talked about how the Center for Nonprofits was kind of deferring to us to represent the arts nonprofit sector. So therefore they kind of said we wouldn't duplicate, we would just work with, if the Arts Council received arts specific ARPA funding, then they would focus theirs on the other aspects of the nonprofit sector. So that way we're amplifying. I think, as we all know, sometimes the arts can fall lower in priority. So we have tried to be very strategic in our approach for this funding.
Amber, we do have 2 questions right now in the queue. One is from Arlita Harris, and she's asking, do you want to know our anticipated project proposals now?
I would love for you to email them to me. That would be wonderful, especially as right now we're in the process of going through the eligibility review. I anticipate when it starts to move out of the eligibility review being cleared and we start having more dialogue and more performance hearings, I would really love to know what's happening, like I mentioned. So yes, if you wanted to email those to me, I can have Joel put my email in the chat. And if you're willing to share, or if you want to set up a phone conversation where we kind of meet one-on-one and just talk about what the scope of your work and request is going to be. Therefore, I can at least not speak on behalf of your request, but just be cognizant and aware of it in my conversations with members.
We also have a question from William Coberly. And he's asking, can you give us an idea of how ARPA funds might be channeled to urban-based organizations?
We have been talking with both Allied Arts and the Tulsa Arts Alliance about working in collaboration as we look at the urban-based organizations, in particular because of the feedback I was given from multiple members that really talked about the importance of rural and vulnerable populations. While this hasn't been solidified, one of the aspects that has been conveyed to me is that even if an urban-based organization qualified for funding, one of the things that has been vocalized to me is a potential requirement that either those urban-based organizations are able to demonstrate their work in rural and or with vulnerable populations. And at this time, vulnerable populations has not been defined to me, has not been defined to our agency. So again, like I mentioned, I'm speaking with less information than we would like to have. So we will still continue to have those conversations. And as we get more clarity from the legislature about how urban-based organizations and what would be required of organizations across the state in terms of that aspect, we will share that out. But right now, these are just conversations.
Okay, we have another question. This one is from Christy Alcox, and she asks, do we have the support of the state chamber and members, or are we competing organizations?
I think the reality is that we're somewhat competing organizations. Do we have the state chamber? You know, that's a great question. I need to meet with the state chamber. I've been working really closely with components of the state government, like Lieutenant Governor's office, but that's a great point, and that's something I need to strengthen and make sure that they have this on their radar. I do think that there is a component, a natural component of competition based on what they might be requesting. I will say that I do feel strongly that we're bold in our ask for the arts, and feel like the arts and cultural sector have, I feel, as much right to be in this space to support the work that you're doing as much as the quote unquote traditional business sector. But great point, Christy. I'm going to make a note of that. I'm going to follow up.
Does anybody else have a question? You can raise your hand or you can type it into the chat.
Joel and Amber, this is Kay Decker up in Alba again. And which one of you would like to have data and the qualitative anecdotal types of stories? I don't want to flood anybody's email, but I just finished the preliminary annual report for our arts organization, and there are some fairly compelling data points that I think you all need to be knowledgeable about. So just tell me who, and I'll share.
All right, we're going to put Joachim, who is our cultural development director. We'll have him be the key point person, and I'll ask Joel to put his email in the chat.
Okay.
Joachim handles the data, and Joachim and Joel and I kind of work in this space, and I think that would be perfect.
Okay.
I appreciate any strong stories. You know, whenever I turn to our staff a lot of times to help pull these stories together, and it's always nice to have some on hand when it's not, hey, you're presenting tomorrow for the legislature, because it's usually a very fast turnaround and trying to pull that storytelling. It's wonderful to have that data already in hand to turn to. So I appreciate that, Kay.
Sure.
I did see the question from Norman about Allied Arts and Tulsa Arts Alliance are member organizations, and not all urban arts organizations are members. Correct. If they become sub-grantors of the urban communities, will this be addressed? Absolutely. In our proposal, we have worked with Tulsa Arts Alliance and allied arts, just in terms of like starting the conversation about what that would look like, given the scope, if we were to get such huge amounts of money that we would need to have the bandwidth to work with our rural-based and the non-member organizations. The Arts Council would handle any organization that would not be a member agency. So in terms of eligibility and all of that. So no one would be penalized for not being one of those members. It would not impact eligibility or access to these funds at all. In fact, you know, we would be working in tandem, and we would make sure that there wasn't duplication. What we're looking for is trying to stretch those dollars. Our request has been that we would break down the funding of whatever amount we get for the reopening and rebuilding of the cultural sector, the arts and cultural sector, that it would be a 50-50 divide between our rural and urban-based organizations. And so no need for concern. Hopefully that limits any kind of anxiety you might have in that space. We did think of that because we do know many organizations are not members, and we wanted to make sure they were not left off of the recovery.
We also have a question from Sherry Ishmael Waldrop. Mm-hmm. For the small rural organizations who work primarily with volunteers, how can we benefit from these funds?
So what I can say, Sherry, is that not all of the funding has to go to payroll and the actual people. I think we have just tried to build in flexibility around the fact of building up personnel, because so many organizations did end up laying off or reducing salaries or reducing personnel, but it is not limited to that. We anticipate that even organizations that have volunteers would be able to use these funds to help with revenue loss, whether that was your corporate sponsorship or other revenue streams that you had that were depleted or reduced based on the pandemic, as well as other eligible expenses related to COVID and recovery. Technology, other aspects that help your organization provide the programming and kind of rebuild for the next 10 years. The way that we really approached this work was we wanted some funds that would be obviously the flexibility for them to be used in the short term that met the ARPA guidelines. But we also, in our proposal, really made the case that we're trying to build the Oklahoma that we want for the next 10 years, the next decade. We're trying to build the foundation, not just help you get out of the hole you might be in because of the pandemic, but actually building the foundation for a stronger tomorrow and the next decade moving forward. So there are some short-term eligibility expenditures, but they're not all related to personnel. And those, I think, are things that once we see how much money we get and what flexibility we will have and what directive we're given from the legislature. I mean, one piece of this that is still very much missing is that typically when we receive funding from the legislature, from any part of state government, you know, usually priorities and other directives are related to how those funds would be.
Okay, Tawny from Oklahomans from the Arts is asking, will the slide deck be shared with participants of this meeting?
I'm happy we can. Joel, will you help me be able to get this out?
we can make it available, and we can also upload this to our YouTube channel.
Okay, I'm not the IT person, have to go to the right IT person. Yes, we will make sure this is available and accessible, Tawny.
Randy Norman asks, would these funds be available to build our broadband system rather than use hotspots for the current site we have in Okemah?
That's a great question, Randy, because we did build in some language around technology enhancements, knowing the fact that so many organizations, when we had to pivot to hybrid or full virtual programming, obviously that was a huge cost. We have not addressed this yet, so this is a great question. This might be one that I'll have to flush out a little bit more with the legislature. As I mentioned, there was a fourth working group that had to do with rural development and infrastructure, which completely addresses broadband the broadband question is the priority of that fourth working subgroup. This may be a question which I'm going to note that we will continue to have clarified, given the fact that broadband may be addressed through another ARPA channel that might be accessible to organizations. And with that, I don't know the full answer, but this does prompt us to seek more clarity as this continues. So that's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up.
Anyone else? Other questions?
We good? Well, I'm going to turn it, well, I thank everybody for being here. I am going to turn it over really quickly to Joel.
Sure. So as hopefully you're aware, next week is the 2021 Oklahoma Arts Conference, and we'll be in Muskogee, and hopefully we will see many of you there next week. If this is somehow not yet on your radar and you'd like to try and join us, you still can. As we see the conference page there, we are accepting walk-up registrations. We always want to accommodate. So we will be set up at the Muskogee Civic Center all day Wednesday, all day Thursday, and all day Friday. Feel free to come join us. Registration is $179 for the 2 full days on Thursday and Friday. And then there are some pre-conference sessions happening on Wednesday. And of those pre-conference sessions, there's actually an executive directors roundtable, and this is being offered at no cost. This is a forum for executive directors to gather, and we're really stepping back during this time and allowing you as peers to gather and discuss issues that are important and that help kind of just share what you're dealing with, what you're going through, ideas. And ways that you can help each other out. So that's occurring at Muskogee Little Theater from 1 o'clock to 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And it's being presented actually by Scott Stuhlen from Philbrook Museum of Arts, Eddie Walker from Oklahoma Contemporary, Connie Wetz from the Muskogee Little Theater. And then we're very fortunate to have Margie Reese, who is nationally known in the arts. Many of you may know Margie. She is a board member with Mid-America Arts Alliance, and she is going to join, I believe, virtually to be part of this as well. So you can see the information there on screen. RSVP with Kayla, our community arts director, and her email is there. Again, this is whether you have registered for the conference or not, you are more than welcome to come be part of this. So we hope to see you next week.
Okay, thanks, Joel. Well, I want to thank you all and be respectful of your time. 3 minutes early, just 3 minutes given back to you. But honestly, thank you for spending an hour with us. Again, we'll continue to try to be as candid and share the information that we have. It's taken us a while to kind of pull and see the momentum moving in this space because the ecosystem was so nebulous for a while, but now that it feels like it's really moving forward, we wanted to give you an update. So thank you for all that you're doing day in and day out. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend. For those of you who are able to join us at the conference, we look forward to connecting with you. I'm showing our branded mask that I put around my mug for the call. So excited to share and try to have a safe forum where we connect and recharge. So until the next time, thank you all, and we'll see you soon. And thanks to my wonderful team. Bye.